You are doing everything right. You wake up early. You lace up your shoes. You go out and you run. 3 times a week, maybe 4. You have been doing this for months, possibly years. You watch what you eat. You stay consistent. And yet when you look in the mirror, the belly fat is still there. Maybe it is more than it was 2 years ago. Even though you are exercising more than you ever have. And somewhere in the back of your mind a question has been quietly forming that you have not wanted to say out loud. What if the exercise I am doing is actually making this harder? That question is not irrational. That question is correct. And today I am going to show you exactly why, with the science to back every word of it. The exercise you need to stop relying on if you want to lose belly fat after 40 is long, steady-state cardio. Running at a consistent pace for 45 minutes or more. Cycling at the same speed for an hour. The elliptical, the treadmill, the same effort level sustained for the same duration, repeated week after week. And before you feel defensive about this, I want to be clear about something important. This is not about effort. The people who do this kind of exercise are some of the most disciplined, most committed people I have ever worked with. The problem is not their dedication. The problem is that after the age of 40, the hormonal environment inside the human body changes in ways that make long steady-state cardio not just ineffective for belly fat, but actively counterproductive. And almost nobody has explained to them why. My name is Dr. Sarah Monroe. I spent over 12 years in internal medicine, and one of the most consistent and most frustrating conversations I had with patients in their 40s and 50s was this one: they were exercising, they were not losing the weight they wanted to lose, and they could not understand why. The answer, in almost every case, came down to the same thing: they were fighting their hormones instead of working with them, and the exercise they were doing was making the hormonal fight harder, not easier. So let us go through what is actually happening, starting with what changes in your body after 40, and then exactly what to do about it. After the age of 40, a series of hormonal shifts begin that fundamentally change how your body responds to exercise, how it stores fat and where it stores it. Understanding these shifts is not optional information. It is the foundation of everything that follows. Because if you try to lose belly fat after 40 using the same approach that worked at 28, you will fail. Not because you are not working hard enough, because you are working against a biology that has changed. The first shift is a gradual decline in estrogen in women and testosterone in men. Both of these hormones play a direct role in where the body preferentially stores fat. When estrogen is adequate, the female body tends to store fat peripherally, in the hips, thighs, and buttocks. As estrogen declines through perimenopause and menopause, the body shifts its fat storage pattern toward the abdomen. This is visceral fat, the fat that accumulates deep inside the abdominal cavity, surrounding the organs. It is metabolically active, inflammatory, and significantly harder to shift than subcutaneous fat. In men, declining testosterone produces a similar redistribution. Fat that once stayed peripheral migrates inward. The belly that appears in a man's 40s and 50s is not a failure of willpower. It is a direct biological consequence of a changed hormonal environment directing fat storage to a new location. The second shift is a rise in insulin resistance after 40. Cells become progressively less sensitive to insulin, which means blood sugar stays elevated for longer after meals, and the body releases more insulin to compensate. Chronically elevated insulin is one of the most powerful fat storage signals in the human body. It suppresses the breakdown of fat for energy and actively promotes the deposition of new fat, particularly in the visceral region. You can be eating a reasonable diet and exercising regularly, and if your insulin sensitivity is declining, fat loss will slow significantly because the hormonal signal to store fat is outcompeting the signal to burn it. The third shift, and this is the one that connects directly to the exercise conversation, is an increase in cortisol sensitivity. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone, and one of its most well-documented physiological effects is a promotion of visceral fat accumulation. The abdominal region has a higher density of cortisol receptors than anywhere else in the body. When cortisol is chronically elevated, those receptors respond by pulling fat from circulation and depositing it directly into the visceral compartment. This is not a theory. This is established endocrinology, documented in research going back decades. And after the age of 40, the body becomes significantly more sensitive to cortisol's fat-storing effects, because the hormonal counterweights, estrogen and testosterone, that previously buffered cortisol's impact are declining. Now, here's where the exercise conversation becomes critical. Lung. Sustained steady-state cardio, running, cycling. Sustained elliptical work for 45 minutes or more at a moderate consistent pace is one of the most effective cortisol-elevating activities a human being can do. A study published in the Journal of Endocrinology found that prolonged moderate-intensity exercise lasting 45 minutes or more produces a significant and sustained rise in cortisol levels that can persist for several hours after the session ends. In a 25-year-old with robust estrogen or testosterone levels, this cortisol response is buffered. The hormonal environment absorbs it and recovery proceeds efficiently. In a 48-year-old whose estrogen or testosterone has declined significantly, that same cortisol response hits a system that is far more vulnerable to its fat-storing effects. The long cardio session that was helping at 30 is, after 40, potentially triggering the exact hormonal signal that promotes abdominal fat deposition. There is a second mechanism that makes chronic cardio counterproductive after 40, and it is muscle. After the age of 35, the body begins to lose muscle mass at a rate of approximately 1 to 2% per year in the absence of specific stimulation to maintain it. This process, called sarcopenia, accelerates after 40, and muscle mass is directly tied to your resting metabolic rate, the number of calories your body burns at complete rest simply to maintain basic biological functions. For every kilogram of muscle you lose, your resting metabolic rate drops by approximately 50 to 70 calories per day. That does not sound dramatic until you calculate what it means over a decade. 10 years of gradual muscle loss without targeted resistance training can reduce your resting metabolic rate by 300 to 500 calories per day, which means you now need to eat 300 to 500 fewer calories just to maintain the same weight. And belly fat, which was manageable before, becomes increasingly difficult to shift because the metabolic engine that was burning it has become smaller. Long steady-state cardio does almost nothing to prevent sarcopenia. In fact, chronic high-volume cardio without adequate protein intake can accelerate muscle loss because the body under sustained caloric expenditure will break down muscle tissue for fuel if muscle protein synthesis is not being actively stimulated. You are spending an hour on the treadmill, burning calories in the short term, but potentially accelerating the very muscle loss that is slowing your metabolism and making belly fat harder to lose in the long term. This is why people in their 40s and 50s who do only cardio can work extraordinarily hard and see progressively smaller results. It is not a motivation problem. It is a biology problem, and biology responds to different inputs. So what does work? What does the research actually support for visceral fat loss after 40? Given this hormonal environment, the answer comes in 3 specific forms of exercise, each targeting visceral fat through a different biological pathway, and each producing a cortisol response that is far more favorable than prolonged steady state. Cardio. The first and most important is resistance training, lifting weights, using resistance bands, doing bodyweight exercises that challenge your muscles against meaningful load. The evidence here is remarkably consistent. A meta-analysis published in the journal Obesity Reviews, analyzing data from over 700 studies, found that resistance training was the most effective single exercise modality for reducing visceral fat, independent of changes in body weight, not total fat, specifically visceral fat. The dangerous abdominal fat, that is directly linked to cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic dysfunction. The mechanism operates through multiple pathways simultaneously. Resistance training directly stimulates muscle protein synthesis, which preserves and builds the metabolically active muscle tissue. That raises your resting metabolic rate. It improves insulin sensitivity. Research shows that a single resistance training session can improve insulin sensitivity for up to 24 hours afterward, reducing the chronic elevated insulin signal that promotes visceral fat deposition. It produces a cortisol response that is sharp and brief, peaking during the session, and returning to baseline rapidly, rather than the prolonged elevation produced by sustained cardio, and it stimulates the release of growth hormone, which declines with age and plays a direct role in fat metabolism and muscle preservation. You do not need a gym. You do not need equipment. Squats, lunges, push-ups, rows using a resistance band, hip hinges, planks, these are all effective resistance training movements that challenge the major muscle groups and produce the metabolic and hormonal responses that matter. 3 sessions per week of 30 to 40 minutes is sufficient to produce meaningful results. The sessions do not need to be exhausting. They need to be consistently challenging, meaning the last few repetitions of each set should require genuine effort. The second form of exercise that the research consistently supports for visceral fat after 40 is high-intensity interval training, which I will refer to as HIIT, not the hour-long HIIT classes that have become popular, which often produce the same prolonged cortisol response as steady cardio. True HIIT intervals of genuine maximum effort lasting 20 to 40 seconds, followed by full recovery, periods of 60 to 90 seconds, for a total session duration of 15 to 20 minutes. A study published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine found that HIIT produced significantly greater reductions in total body fat and abdominal fat compared to continuous moderate intensity exercise, despite requiring less than half the total exercise time. The reason comes down to a phenomenon called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC. After a true high-intensity interval session, your body's oxygen consumption, and therefore its caloric expenditure, remains elevated for hours after the session ends. Your metabolism is literally running hotter for the rest of the day. This post-exercise metabolic elevation is minimal after steady-state cardio, and significant after high-intensity intervals, to 15-minute HIIT sessions per week, combined with resistance training, produces a metabolic and hormonal environment that is vastly more favorable for visceral fat loss. After 40 than 5 hours of moderate steady cardio, the third element is one that Dr. Alex has spoken about in the context of cardiovascular health, and it applies equally powerfully here: daily walking at a gentle pace. Not running, not power walking. A comfortable, conversational pace walk of 20 to 30 minutes, preferably after a meal. This type of low-intensity movement produces the smallest cortisol response of any exercise form. It activates the insulin-independent glucose uptake pathway in your leg muscles, directly reducing post-meal blood sugar, and the insulin response that follows. And it supports the parasympathetic nervous system, gradually reducing baseline cortisol over time rather than spiking it. It is not glamorous, it is not intense, and it is one of the most consistently supported interventions for visceral fat management in the research literature for adults over 40. So the weekly framework that the evidence supports looks like this: 3 sessions of resistance training, 30 to 40 minutes each, targeting all major muscle groups. 2 sessions of true HIIT, 15 to 20 minutes each with full recovery between intervals, and daily walking of 20 to 30 minutes, ideally after your largest meal. Total weekly exercise time is comparable to or less than most cardio-only routines. The hormonal effect on visceral fat is dramatically different. There are 2 non-exercise factors I cannot leave out of this conversation, because exercise alone cannot override them. The first is sleep. Research published in the Annals of Internal Medicine found that sleep deprivation of even 2 hours per night, sustained over 2 weeks, significantly elevated cortisol levels, increased ghrelin, the hunger hormone, and reduced leptin, the satiety hormone. The net effect was increased visceral fat deposition and reduced fat burning. Even in people who are exercising, you cannot outtrain a chronically elevated cortisol environment. Sleep is not optional in the belly fat equation after 40. It is foundational. The second is protein intake after 40. The body requires more dietary protein to achieve the same muscle protein synthesis response as in earlier decades, a phenomenon called anabolic resistance. Research suggests that adults over 40 need approximately 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day to effectively preserve and build muscle mass. Most people eating a standard diet are getting significantly less than this. Without adequate protein, resistance training cannot produce its full effect on muscle preservation, and the metabolic benefits it offers for visceral fat loss are diminished. Prioritize protein at every meal. Aim for at least 30 grams per meal from high-quality sources: eggs, fish, chicken, Greek yogurt, legumes, cottage cheese. Let me bring this together clearly, because I want you to leave this video with a complete picture of what to change and why. After 40, the hormonal environment, declining estrogen or testosterone, rising insulin resistance, increased cortisol sensitivity, creates conditions that make long steady-state cardio ineffective for belly fat and potentially counterproductive. The prolonged cortisol elevation it produces hits a system that is now far more vulnerable to cortisol's visceral fat-promoting effects. Meanwhile, the muscle loss it fails to prevent is quietly reducing the metabolic engine that burns fat at rest. The solution is not less effort, it is redirected effort. Resistance training 3 times per week to preserve muscle, improve insulin sensitivity, and produce a favorable cortisol profile. To brief HIIT sessions to generate the post-exercise metabolic elevation that steady cardio cannot produce. Daily walking to manage blood sugar, reduce baseline cortisol, and support the parasympathetic nervous system. Adequate protein to support muscle protein synthesis, and sufficient sleep to keep cortisol from undermining everything else you are doing. Your body after 40 is not broken. It is not betraying you. It has changed and it needs a different approach. One that works with its new hormonal reality rather than against it. The frustration you have felt doing cardio and not seeing the results you expected is not a character flaw. It is a mismatch between an approach designed for one hormonal environment being applied to a different one. Now you know what that environment actually needs. I want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me how long you have been doing cardio and whether belly fat has been resistant despite your effort. Your answer might be exactly what another person reading the comments needs to see to realize they are not alone in this experience. And tell me if you have already tried resistance training after 40 and what changed when you did. If this video gave you an explanation you have been looking for, please share it with someone you know who is in their 40s or 50s and struggling with the same frustration. This is one of those videos that genuinely changes how people approach their health, and it deserves to reach the people who need it. If you are not subscribed, please do that now. This channel is built on honest, specific, science-grounded information for real people navigating real health challenges at every age. I am Dr. Sarah Monroe. Your biology has not given up on you. It is waiting for the right signal. Now you know exactly how to send it.